For our next speaker, we have Qixia Luo from University of
So first, I'd like to thank the organizers of this workshop for giving me the opportunity to speak. So today I'll talk about graphical discrete Lyapunov models under Non-Gaussianity, and in particular, I'll speak about the problems of structural identifiability and learning. This project is a joint work with my PhD supervisor, Lyapunov. So, okay, so to begin, I want to start with an application, which is going to... Okay, it's better.
I think have to raise the volume.
Okay.
Crossing fingers. Is it any better?
Thank you.
Okay, so this application is going to lead us naturally to a problem about tensors. So this application is called gene regulatory network reconstruction, which is a causal inference problem that arises in the field of genomics, where researchers are kind of interested in the inferring the causal relationships between various genes of interest in the cell. So these causal relationships are kind of depicted via a weighted directed graph. So the vertices of this graph kind of represents the various genes of interest, and we have a directed edge, say from the vertex A to vertex B. If the gene that is represented by A has a direct exon type T has a direct influence on the gene B at the next time point, so 2+1. So to get a kind of an understanding of this causal picture, researchers will collect data from cells and then analyze this data and then try to infer various aspects of this causal graph. So there are kind of several types of data that can be used for this end. So first, there's like time series data, which is data that's collected from multiple time points, and there's also something called knockdown or overexpression experimental data. So in this case, researchers will conduct experiments and then control the expression of certain genes and see how this affects other genes of interest, and kind of draw conclusions this way. And the third type of data is steady state data at a single point point. So this type of data is observational data, which means that researchers don't intervene in the gene expressions, so they don't conduct any experiments. And this type of data is also collected from a single point in time once a gene regulatory network has stabilized, so it's stationarity. So out of these three types of data, the third type of data is the most readily available, yet kind of using it to infer the causal graph is somehow the most difficult and the most well understood. And therefore, we will take a closer look at the task of learning the causal graph from this third type of data today. So from steady state data as a single point. And before we jump into kind of trying to do this, we kind of sort of want to ask the question of structural identifiability, which has to do with the question of to what extent is this learning possible? So the problem with structural identifiability asks the question, can two different causal graphs give rise to observationally equivalent single time point steady state data? So if this were to happen, then we can't really distinguish between these two causal graphs just from the single time point steady state data. And so there will be some limitations to what can be learned. So maybe we cannot learn the true unique underlying causal graph, but maybe only an equivalent class of causal graph that contains the true as a representative. Okay, one way to kind of model the gene regulatory network is using a autoregressive model or shorts. So this model contains like sequences of random vectors indexed on the integers, which you can interpret as discrete time. So that satisfies these 2 points. So at time 0, x0 is just equal to some noise vector x0, and then for each time t bigger than or equal to 1, x3 is equal to some fixed matrix A times xt minus 1 plus a fresh noise vector epsilon t. And yeah, some assumptions on the noise process is that it's always zero moved and it's IID over time. And at each time, its components are independent, but not necessarily identically distributed. Okay, so and A here is going to be the weighted adjacency matrix that includes and it's well known theorem that when A is sure stable, which means that all of its eigenvalues have more or less than one, then the bar1 consensus is going to be steady state distribution, and we're going to use these steady states to model the steady states of deregulatory networks. And in fact, we're going to be giving certain special subsets of these steady states that arise from bar1 processes that are associated with certain graphs, a special name. So it's a directed graph G, and okay, so consider all matrices A that are weighted adjacency matrices of the graph G that are also sure stable, and then think about all of the bar1 processes that are driven by these indices A, and then think about all the steady states that arise from these bar1 processes. So this collection of discrete probability distributions is called the graphical discrete Lyapunov model associated with, and for short, we're going to denote this by GDL and bracket G. Okay, so in this setup, we can sort of reformulate our problem of causal graph learning as the task of whether or not we can recover G from the distributions in GDL and G. So if this is possible, then how can we do this in a practical way using data that are eyeing some distribution from GDL and G? Okay, so just as an example, on the left-hand side, you have a weighted directed graph, and on the right-hand side, you have its associated weighted adjacency matrix. So by the sparsity pattern of A, I just mean the position of the zeros in this matrix, and the position of the zeros corresponds to missing edges in the graph. So, for example, A01 is 0 because there's no edge from 1 to 0 in the graph. Okay, and the problem of structural identifiability can be formulated as the question of whether or not GDL on G and GDL on H can intersect not trivially when G is not equal to H. Okay, so if this were true, then we kind of have global identifiability, which means that given a distribution from GDL and G, it can only arise from the graph G. But maybe this is too optimistic, so we kind of also ask the question, okay, so maybe they do intersect, how big is this intersection? Because maybe as long as the intersection is not too big, then in practice, most of the time, when you're given a distribution from GDL and G, it can only come from G. So, yeah. Okay, so now I want to talk about accumulants, which is also how we bring tensors into this problem. So, okay, so accumulants are just kind of, there's a one-to-one correspondence between accumulants and moments of a polynomial distribution. So accumulants are just some polynomial explanation of the moments. And so given a random vector x with p coordinates, its accumulants of order n can be indexed by multi-indices. And so we can just arrange them in the arrange accumulants of order n in the shape of an order n tensor with dimension p along each node. Okay, so actually these graphical discrete Lyapunov models were recently introduced in the work of Non, and in their paper, which is titled Identifiability in Graphical Discrete Lyapunov Models, they represented these stationary distributions in the models by their accumulant tensors, and they have T2, T3, T4 for the second order, third order, accumulant tensors. So in their work, they only studied the parameter identifiability in these models. So they didn't study structural identifiability. Basically, this is the problem. The problem of parameter identifiability is the problem of so when you're given a distribution from GDL and you know the graph G, is it possible to clearly identify the edge weights of the graph G? So yeah, so it turns out they kind of discovered that like non-Gaussianity is like very important for identifiability to hold, and also somehow like the graph having several roots everywhere also helps a lot. And they have this nice result that says that so when G is a known directed acyclic graph, or DAG for short, that has like self loops at every vertex, and the noise is non-Gaussian, then yes, we have generic parameter identifiability in the models. And by generic, I just mean, they mean that exclude the set of parameters of measure 0. And in fact, we don't even need the whole distribution for identifying the regional. To hold, we only need the stationary cumulants of borders less than 4. Okay, so one more thing I want to mention, and before moving on, is that due to the independence assumption of our noise process, its cumulant tensors of all orders are diagonal. So yeah, and we're going to denote these order n cumulant tensor by capital omega superscript n, and denote its diagonal entries by little omega superscript n subscript 0 minus 1. So this will be so yeah, so now I want to talk about the higher order Lyapunov equations, which are these two equations here. They're equivalent. Yeah, so when m is equal to 2, and yeah, when m is bigger than or equal to 3, it's called the higher order Lyapunov equations. So these equations relate so the stationary cumulant tensors of the bar 1 subset, which are the TMs, with the error cumulant tensors, which are the capital omega m's, and the adjacency matrix of the bar 1 subset state. So yeah, okay, so let's take a closer look at the first version of the higher order Lyapunov equation. So this one is interesting because it kind of has a nice combinatorial interpretation. So this interpretation is called track rule, and it's used for computing the coordinates of the entries of TM as a extension that are indexed by these combinatorial structures called equitracks. So I just want to kind of demonstrate how this works with an example. So suppose we so Q2 is the second order element how do I go full screen? Okay. So Q2 here is this is the second order stationary equivalence, and it's just a covariance comparison. So suppose we want to compute the entropy of the position 1, 2. So what you do is that you look in the graph, and then you find the distance, and then you look for these combinatorial structures called equitracks that end at one and two. So what are they? So they're just a pair of diagonal paths that have the same source. The two paths have the same source, and the first path has to end at 1, and the second path ends at 2, and then both paths have the same length. So 12. We may remember the word equity. So when you kind of look at stare at this graph, you'll see that the only equitracks that end at 1 and 2 have to have the possible. And you can pass them sort of like any length. So for example, we can just have one path that's just goes from 0 to 1, and the other path from 0 to 2. That corresponds to this first equitrack here. And then because of that self and loop zero, we can sort of just keep having self loops to each path, and then use the same people. There's one so 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1 for one path, and 0, 0, 2 for the other path. Okay, so this entry of T2 is working as this sum of normals, where there is a one-to-one correspondence between the normals and the equitracks. So for example, this first one, we have so this is the second order error cumulant of the vertex associated with the vertex 0, because that's the top of this equitrack. And then we have A10 because that's the first equitrack normal associated with the first path in the equitrack, and we have A20, which is associated with the second path in the equitrack. And similarly for the other problems, and in this case, this is a simple sum because it's just a series, and that simplifies to that Russian expression. Okay, that's converged because A00 is less than has absolute value less than 1 into A being a short state matrix. Okay, so I just want to say a couple words about the second equation, and this is actually where we see why the error is Gaussian, then we sort of have more information about what they do. So there's a very important property about K1 specifies that the vanishing of higher order K1s characterizes Gaussian distributions. So for a multivariate Gaussian distribution, it's a K1s of order is greater than 1 is 0, and the converse is also true. So like if the noise were Gaussian, then the Kn is called the stationary distribution is also Gaussian. So the least higher order reactive equation will just make it 0 because there's no information there. However, if the noise is non-Gaussian, then if we look at the second equation like entry by entry, we just get a random polynomial for constraints in the parameters. And this is A, and we can talk about that. Okay, so yeah, so basically now the graphs are on the graph is just given Q's, can we that satisfy these Lyapunov equations for a beautiful is it possible for us to figure out these specified data? And the harder task is to do this using only low order stationary fields because high order fields are very difficult to estimate on data. And yeah, the structural identifiability just becomes the problem of whether can satisfy these Lyapunov equations for 2 A's with different specified. Okay, so now I just want to present some answers to these questions. So we have resolved about the generic structural identifiability for DAGs. So we show that DAGs with self-groups that each vertex are numerically structurally identifiable on this if the noise is non-Gaussian. So I'll just talk about exactly what we do. So we have 2 different DAGs. GA for the same number of vertices with self-groups that have vertex. The GD on G and GD on H will have their own parameter spaces. We have to learn about image and data H. So the parameter space associated with graph G is a sequence. So the first element is being played with adjacency matrix corresponding to graph G, and then we have a sequence of error codes. So what we showed is that there exists sets of exceptional parameters for G and H, which were driven by SP and SH, whose truncated elements. So like here, so we're choosing A, which is the weighted frequency matrix, and then we're truncated here is square plus 2. So we show that these truncated elements lie in the zero sets, and that if a sequence of stationary forms were to arise from some parameter space associated with G, like this is exceptional set, then the sequence of stationary forms cannot also arise from the parameter space associated with the graph H minus this exceptional set. Okay, so some caveats is that our proof utilizing the entire sequence of parameters, so just like one of the reasons why we weren't able to translate our proof into an algorithm, I can ask you to back. And yeah, so this is a kind of one thing that we are interested in for research, which is and finally, I want to say that the problem of the practice becomes much easier if we know that the underlying practice of tree if yourself is only the test. So in fact, we call it that's based on stationary K1s of less than equal to a order less than 55. That's guaranteed to be return the correct tree. As also something yeah, so we don't see a easy way of translating this into relying on the fact that it's going to be the source. Yeah, and we just make it up. The first is how we use special type of services where certain like based factors if it's the source of the yeah, so we just like looking at the test these based factors which are assigned to a set of vertices whether or not they allow special type of services. So we first learn the which are sources and which is actually which are the whole tree. That's Oh, it's just so it's just cut out by one polynomial that we have the equation for. So it kind of it's the implicitization of like some rational parameterization. Like it was very easy to find like once we found the parameterization, which is kind of the hyperparameter.
This non-Gaussian assumption. I would start with a under fraction of the Gaussian is essentially like the same as your numerical system or not system, and then there's like a clear amount of identifiability tests or criteria for the numerical system. And when you contact the Gaussian assumption, what or how could you maybe relate it to the like a dynamical system without the Gaussian model?
Okay, so I don't really know much about dynamical systems, so I have to say in our context, if the noise is Gaussian, then basically you can learn like anything, like we have a counter example of that. So
like testing the like covariance.
yeah, but like we show that we have a counter example that says that you can't even learn the graph that go just on two vertices that go. The first one goes from A to B, and the second one goes from B to
No, there is a textbook by Bernard Schellkopf, which is sort of all about like learning the or the models in the elemental causal learning.
yeah, can I yeah, this is the model so I have to